Education has been called the gateway to the American dream. This is the dream that should be equally afforded to all citizens in this country. The public school system was that passport to accomplishing this dream. Many of the low-income and minority students in the public education system attend low-performing schools that are underfunded and under-resourced. Unfortunately, these funding inequities have contributed to the creation of low-quality education for those students with the greatest need, and thus making the American dream an elusive dream. The daunting reality is that abhorrent funding injustices continue to exist in this country, and too often the schools serving students with the most significant needs receive the fewest resources. The growing consensus is that poverty, socioeconomic status, and inequity in educational resources have led to the continued oppression of minorities. In addition to federal and local funding policies, segregation complicated funding gaps. Laws were passed to discourage segregation, also ushered in new funding policies for schools. In 1972, the Emergency School Aid Act provided federal aid to school districts embarking on desegregation. States that explicitly fought for these segregated policies could not access these funds. But the intrinsic cost of desegregation could not be measured.
As a product of desegregation, and that went from a school that I saw all black teachers, principals, and was in my neighborhood, and to be bused to a whole different area, and everything failed, everything changed. That was traumatic. That was major traumatic. That was a traumatic state. And it was so much so, somewhere or another, we all had to go to summer school to make up what we had missed. Now, I didn't see any white kids in summer school. I saw the little black kids in summer school. Okay, in the long run, you know, I was okay. However, I was one of the unique kids that they thought, well, we're going to experiment with. We're going to put you in the white classroom a half a day. And then the other half, you go back to the all black kids. So they was desegregated, but we were segregated within the school. So it was a lot of messy situation, as the young people would say today. What I noticed was, I mean, I was a kid, but as I've grown up, it's interesting that you mentioned middle class flight. It almost began to, I teach a psychology class, and the final term paper is on slave mentality. And these kids are coming up with all kind of ways that this is having an impact. So all of a sudden, I was almost taught, well, to be outstanding, you have to be, you know, white-like, not black-like. Oh, the smart kids got to go to the white class for a half a day. So I'm thinking, oh, well, I must be really great because I can be with the white people. With that respect is that, well, I'm smart, and so I'm going to act smart. And there was a higher level expectation that I need to perform at a higher level. And then whereas what was communicated to the black kids that did not. Okay, you all are not smart enough to be with the other kids, so you just be here and you perform at what we think you should perform. But in the end, it didn't matter if I was in class with the white people half the day or I was still in summer school. I just know that I had to go to summer school like all of the kids that had to go to summer school that was in desegregation. That was the message that I received. Everybody must go to summer school. However, when I got there was only black kids there. Now take it, we were still being shipped way across campus, right across the city of Pine Bluff to go to the white part. Then, you know, so it has a lot of psychological impact. To the point you think, okay, these are the kids, this is the dream, right? This is the dream, everybody together, you know, balanced, basic, but it was just subtle, micro insults. And as I reflect back as a grown man, and I'm going, well, I think desegregation was positive. And then I go, but then there was a lot of negative there. Desegregation took away leaders in the black community. What happened to the principals? What happened to the teachers? What happened to, to the point where, oh, we need black teachers. Well, what happened to those black teachers when they combined the schools? Who got the job? Black people didn't. The white people got their jobs because they combined. You don't need 3 third-grade teachers. You only need 2. So it had a negative impact on that because students exemplified the behavior that is modeled to them. I mean, and I saw it was black teachers around me, but at the same time, even as a kid, it felt as if there was a power shift. There was a power shift. There was turmoil in the community about, should this happen? And then it happened, and black people celebrating, yay, we desegregate, and that was great. But then there was the other side, but whoa, you sending your babies into an area that is not welcome them into.
I do think that desegregation has had a negative impact on many of our urban schools. And there are some outliers, of course, and there are going to be outliers in every case. But there's a stigma, unfortunately, that has been attached to brown and black people. And when you leave brown and black people behind who have had a history of being disenfranchised and not having opportunities to build up businesses and build up their communities, then that also has a negative impact on the school system.
Local property tax variation has been blamed as a primary cause of inequities and called for greater state funding as a solution.
For local funding in Tennessee, we have a very unusual situation, and particularly here in Madison County, we have it's even more unusual. What's happening across the country is there are many states where the local school board has taxing authority. So obviously then that means exactly as it sounds. The local school board is saying we can set property tax rates and we are generating revenue for our school district and we have control of the purse. Tennessee is not one of those states. So most states across the country are like that. There are a handful of states that are not like that. So Tennessee is, I guess you could say, unique and in the minority out of the 50 states by saying it's not your school board who sets tax rates and raises money. In fact, the school board has no way to raise money. They must instead go to the local governing body, which in Tennessee is the county commission, and for county public school districts, and ask the county to designate the funds that are then going to the school board. So already in Tennessee, we're a little different because our school boards cannot tax. Specifically in Madison County, we have a funding situation where once our county and city districts were merged in the late 1980s, the city agreed to help fund the combined Jackson-Madison County schools, which is makes us a county district that's unique across the entire state. There's no other county in Tennessee that does that. So think to our west here, where you've got Haywood County. The city of Brownsville is not helping pay for schools. And to our south, in Chester County, Henderson is not helping pay for schools. It's just the county pays for the schools. That's just standard in the way Tennessee does it. But not in Jackson-Madison County. Our city actually pays part of the money. So we're here very, very locally. If you go all the way down to Jackson-Madison County schools, we're in a very unique situation. We're in a state that's not like most other states, and we're in a county that's completely different than all other counties.
According to the National Center for Educational Statistics in 2013-2014, Madison County spent over $4,000 in local revenue per student. The actual funding provided by the County Commission in Madison County fiscal capacity created a deficit of about $214 per student. Multiply this number by the student enrollment and you will get a deficit of over $1 million.
On the local level, the evidence shows there is a I would describe a major funding shortage for Jackson-Madison County schools. And part of what I consider to be shortage is a comparison of what is happening in terms of the county's commitment to fund the local school district compared to what the county could provide in local funding. And that, at initial glance, it sounds like, well, how could you know what the county could do? Well, actually, there's lots of different ways you could know what the county could do. In fact, there's two groups, one in Nashville and one that's housed at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, who calculate a number called fiscal capacity. And fiscal capacity is a measurement of what could the local county be giving per student in terms of funding to the local district. Now, it's not the same measure as what they are giving. These are actually two different measures. So one's a projection of what could they give, and that means, based on the property tax available, the property base rather that could be taxed, the sales tax revenue that comes in, that kind of stuff. So the first part is what could the county be giving? It's called fiscal capacity. The other then is a measurement of what are they actually giving, and then obviously then you subtract the two to figure out, are they giving more or are they giving less? In Jackson, Madison County, our county commission gives far less than what they could give.
The nation's prosperity and future growth depends heavily on the quality of its schools. Increasing financial funding could help K-12 schools implement improvements such as hiring and retaining quality teachers, reducing class sizes, and expanding the availability of a rigorous early education program. The problem is that some states have focused on less funding for education for over the last decade. These cuts jeopardize the school's capacity to develop an intelligent and creative generation of employees.
I think what's happening in some of our urban schools is we don't yet have this broad and consistent approach to bring the level of instruction up to where it needs to be. What I'm seeing is I'm seeing pockets of reasons to be optimistic. So, in Shelby County schools, for example, the Memphis area, they have the iZone initiative, the Achievement School District, and there's some other things that are happening in different places outside of Tennessee. And so there's certain things you look at and you say, oh, this charter school is working, this type of public school is raising scores. But I don't think yet we've hit on anything that is broadly helping all schools. We've just only are seeing some little pockets that we haven't yet figured out how to replicate for everybody.
Primarily because students are in the urban environment is they have parents that do not have the educational level that they may perceive as important. Many parents go, well, I wasn't good in math. So they expect their child not to be good in math. Oh, I didn't like school. Well, then their child don't like school. So it's elevated. So then you have, in an urban environment, you have this excuse game. There's a high level of expectation, or a low level of expectation. The teachers don't think, oh, well, I don't expect much out of this minority student. And they act accordingly. If a student missed something or missed a class, missing days or failed a test, they would go, oh, well, I expect that. That's within the norm. Okay. Then on the other end, the parents would basically, the higher your level of education, the more important you feel that education is. And I think education is one that is generational. It builds from one generation to the next generation. So if I have a sixth grade education, I might feel as if my child should only need a sixth grade education. If I have a high school education, I'm thinking I want my child to graduate from high school. If I have a college education, then I'm striving for my child to have a college education. And then that being the case, now it's important for you to know 9th through 12th grade, every grade count, ACT, prep work, investing in the child, monitoring the child, education and attainment, going to teacher-parent meetings and being a part of the school. So when those things are not there, and generally that's the impact of that urban, those pieces are not there. And then ultimately, as a dean of students here, I would say, you have this excuse thing happening. Now you have an excuse for failure, you have an excuse for the lack of civility, you have an excuse for everything. It's nobody's fault but the other person. The teachers are pointing at the parents are pointing at the teacher, and the student is going, hey, I have a free ride. My own personal perspective, because I really believe that family and the parent are the primary educators, I think it began in the breakdown with the parent. I think parents need to understand and demand academic excellence from the school. When the parents are not going to conferences, they're not concerned about school board meetings, they're not concerned about anything related educationally, with the exception perhaps athletic programs, that's a problem. Now, parents are greatly involved in going to basketball, football, track meets, my child. But you look at your child in these athletic programs, how much time are they consuming? You know, morning practices, evening practices, weekend practices. But at the same time, how much time are they taking with their study of their academic work? So, and that's the other side. The coaches using these students, they want to be successful, you know, and now they've communicated to our black kids, all you need to do is work out physically, work hard, and you're going to do well. For me, they're not focusing on, if you want to go to college, you need to do well academically, you need to take an ACT and make you NCAA compliant. You know, you have to have at least an 18 on ACT, you have to have a 2.3 or 2.5. They're not concerned about that. Right now, the school system will say, you can really play football athletic program under a 2.0, but you can't graduate with that. Motivate and educate these parents. We have to motivate and educate and hold accountable the teachers and the school system. If we do not hold both sides accountable, then everybody get a free pass. And who are the victims? The students. And then these students that didn't do well academically, I would say do not strive for achievement and academic excellence. That's a whole generation. Now they bringing up a generation and another generation and another generation. So it's almost like it would have to be a cultural shift, a cultural change to go, yes, you can do this. And some of the experiences I have had is to take students that basically did not experience academic excellence, however have potential, and turn that learner on and say, you can do this. Failure is not an option. You can do this. You are descendants of kings and queens. Don't tell me you can't do math, because our people created math. There's an achievement gap with marginalized students because just the term marginalized. Marginalization occurs when there's no support. And there's a theory called marginalization and mattering. Okay, marginalization and mattering indicates that you can decrease the impact of marginalization by creating a mattering environment, and that is caring, communicating that the student matters, that so much so that I am going to hold you accountable for your failures. I'm going to celebrate your achievements, but you matter. You matter so much that I'm going to personally spend time with you to assure that you are successful, to develop a trusting relationship that decreases the impact of marginalization.
Some of the challenges facing urban schools, teachers, and school districts are basically all related to funding. They're funding related. Every day when you pick up the newspaper, you read articles about a decrease in funding for local school districts. And we also know that a lot of the funding is related to the funding base in that particular area. So the family incomes can have an effect in some areas on how much money the schools receive for infrastructure, although it might not affect other aspects of the funding base. So funding is basically one of the biggest challenges that urban school districts are facing. And a shortage of teachers, but I think that's interrelated with funding. So we need to increase teacher salaries.
Probably one of the greatest challenges facing our urban schools is what's happening with a lack of support at home. So I know that inside the school building there are challenges, but so much of what's happening is what's being brought based on the student's background. Perhaps, for example, a lack of exposure to early literacy in the home, and some things that are carryover effect that the school then has to find a way to compensate for. And so what this is doing is creating where it's much more difficult to educate students who come from underprivileged backgrounds because they simply haven't had the normal structure or support that we're expecting a student to bring, even starting with bringing in, for example, at the 4-year-old pre-kindergarten level. So the effects on the school districts of being underfunded would be that they have to make some really tough choices. So they're in a situation where they actually are needing more resources to serve an underprivileged population, which by nature is needier in terms of the resources of the district. And yet, if the district is being underfunded, then what's happening is they have to make some tough choices, and they can't provide all the personnel that's really needed in terms of staffing. They can't provide maybe some of the access to technology, some of the curriculum. We have a thing going on, a dynamic here in Jackson-Madison County that exasperates the situation, in that many of our families have chosen private school options in the area instead of being part of the public schools. But only a certain population goes to private school, and this is an overgeneralization, but it's families who have the means. I mean, these are tuition-generated schools, so it's families who are paying to go to school. The average rate here locally is about $10,000 a student. So you've got a family who can pay $10,000 a student to send them to a private school, and that's not counting all the other costs that go along with sending your kid to private school. It adds up quickly. So you have a certain clientele in the county that's leaving the public schools to choose a private school option. Well, what's happening when they leave is they're no longer part of the average daily membership of that district, which means they're no longer getting funding in the local schools for that student. And so there's less dollars going to the local school district, but the local school district has in it the neediest students who didn't have an opportunity to go anywhere like a private school. So what's happening is there's less money, but it's actually a needier group of kids left in the public schools, and what just was bad was now made worse.
I think one of the reasons why urban schools are failing our most marginalized student population is because parents in those areas are overburdened. They have other things they have to focus on, like making certain that their children have food, that they have housing, and sometimes they can't be as active in their child's education as they would like to. So maybe they can't attend the parent-teacher conferences. Maybe they can't, they don't have time to write letters to their state representatives. And unfortunately, those who are at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder then sometimes are the ones who are the most likely to be left behind.
At home, there was an expectation of academic excellence. I think we might be missing that now in some families.
As time passed, more and more people left their local communities for the allure of major cities and eventually to the suburbs. This shift to the suburbs also shifted property taxes to the suburbs and the schools located there.
I've lived in a few cities, and so I've watched that happen. I mean, I think there are a couple of things that happen. One is the development of private institutions, and then there is middle class. I've just about stopped saying white flight. It's just like middle class flight to the suburb, sometimes leaving what might be I guess some might say it's like an economic donut hole that still has the challenge of funding schools where students would attend and be able to achieve at high levels. So, I mean, I don't have a magic wand to wave, but I do have a sense that when schools and students perform at a high level, parents want their students to attend those institutions. And so it behooves all of us to work to ensure that our public schools are successful, because success breeds success. Success attracts success. And while I don't have just an immediate thought in terms of how we might reverse that trend, I do think that we have good principals. You get good faculty at our institutions, our city urban institutions. Then I think that's going to set us up and set the children up to be successful.
The community is affected by school failure in a number of ways. One, if our elementary and secondary education is not successful, then that affects our pipeline to post-secondary education. So that's one way. A second way is that we know that if we have a well-educated population, they are less likely to engage in criminal activities. A third way that it affects the community is that we again know that an educated community is more likely to contribute positively to the economic infrastructure of that particular community. I think that failing schools definitely has an impact on industries coming to an area and also industries leaving. When corporations are looking for a new place to establish their businesses, they do look at the success of the school systems, not just the elementary and secondary school systems, but they also look to make certain that there's an educated workforce. And then also they know that they are going to have to recruit from that area, and that the individuals that they recruit will be looking for good schools in those neighborhoods. And if they don't have good schools in those neighborhoods, they may not be willing to relocate there.
Connection with community and schooling cannot be understated. So what happens at school is ultimately the fabric of the community, and if not right immediately, it certainly is in the coming years, because elementary students eventually become teenagers who eventually become, the young adults in your community. They become your workforce, they're your economic engine, they're your taxpayer, they're your property owner. And so if we have what is an underprivileged cycle of poverty early, and then the school perhaps being broken as well, can't help correct that, then ultimately what's left is this is what the community is going to look like in the future, because there's nowhere along the way that we could intervene to break the cycle. And really, if you think about it, the only way you could break the cycle is through schools. Like, schools are the only institution in America who could say, here's the cycle of poverty, and we can do something about it. And if schools are not doing something about it, nobody else. I mean, so you've got churches in your community who are playing a potential role in terms of resources. Obviously, they're playing a role in spiritual development, but civic organizations can do a little bit here or there, but nobody is in a position to be as powerful as public schools. I think the long-term effects if the schools do not improve is it's kind of a bleak picture. Like, it's not a positive note to end on. It is it then affects your community, it's your economic driver, it's your overall community development. And so what's going to happen long term is, in any given community where the public school district is just failing, and particularly failing some of the neediest students, then what you're going to have is this overall impact where ultimately families who say, this is not where I want to live anymore, or maybe it's not where I can live. There's perhaps not jobs there anymore. There's not commerce. There's not opportunities. There's not industry, and so it forces then the people who can move to move, and then you're on a downward spiral. Like, how could that community survive under those circumstances? And I think we can look at pockets around West Tennessee, and we can say, once the industry left, and the schools were not able to produce a workforce that would attract new industry, there was no rebounding. I mean, that's just like almost like an old ghost town from the West. It's just, you drive through some towns in West Tennessee and you see the boarded up windows and there's no life downtown anymore, and it's a different era in 2019 than it was even perhaps in the 1980s or 1990s. And a big part of that was the school-community relationship.
How do we support our most marginalized group of students with less money? Schools fail from inadequate funding.
What I think is happening in the school structure is when students are coming to us as educators and they're not ready to learn at the level that we're expecting, then they're already so far behind, and I think we haven't yet figured out what is it that the school's going to have to do in terms of remediation. So, we want a student to come in kindergarten, for example, and we're just expecting that the student would know certain things. They have some early literacy skills, they have some self-help skills, they have some social skills that they would have learned at home. And so when a student lacks those skills, I think we yet, and I'm saying education more broadly, have not figured out what do we have to do to make that up. And so we start out behind, and then the next year we get a little further behind, and the next year we're a little further behind, and we end up with a high school student who just can't make the grade because of this almost like snowball cumulative effect that started really a long time ago. So where school funding issues plays a role, particularly in urban schools where we're serving students who have high need, is that it actually is going to take more money and more resources. So some of that might be support curricularly or with technology, but I think a lot of it is probably just in staffing, the additional personnel needs. And so some of that you're thinking, well, obviously this could be more teachers or more teachers' aides, but even on the, like what you might associate with the social work kind of support, coordinated school health type personnel. And so, we're just not there with funding to provide what some of the most needy schools are going to be asking for and would find sufficient to do what they need to do in terms of educating underprivileged youth. I think school turnaround is possible with the right resources, and I think it probably has to be all the right factors from top to bottom. It's not just about resources in terms of how much money we're going to give the school. You have to have the right school leader. You have to have the right group of teachers. You have to have the right parental support to be a part of making a difference in a school. So there's a lot of factors. It's being done in places across the country, and so that's evidence that it can be done. It's just, how do we take and replicate that for everybody, because we've not figured that part out yet.
Well, I think it has to be a paradigm shift on a society level to save our kids. The paradigm shift would be critically look at real actions or action items that can have an impact. I think research would suggest mattering has an impact. Research would suggest that if a student can be motivated by someone that kind of looks like them and act like them and concerned about them, they do well academically. I think that society as a whole needs to shift. That way, my dream as an educator, then I should be making in the upper, millions of dollars, not running up and down a football field. Now, society as a whole have more, they appreciate the entertainment. Well, perhaps just a little of that entertainment needs to go, well, we need to train our people to do well. In the meanwhile, while we are failing, not just the urban, but in the major city schools, then every generation is getting weaker and weaker. And so then we falling back as a nation, which we are no longer the number one in education anymore. I think we're about like third now. So fourth or fifth. Okay. So we falling back. So as a whole, we need to make this big shift in saying this is important.
I think adequate school funding has a significant impact on the success of a school district. Schools have such a positive impact on students. And we know that a lot of urban schools are doing amazing things with limited resources, but they shouldn't have to. Teachers shouldn't have to use their limited incomes to purchase books and supplies. Those should be automatic for every student. Teachers should not have to work in kind of makeshift classrooms that are in a condition that most of us would describe as deplorable. We've seen those reports, especially in this area. I've seen reports in the Memphis area where they've had to close schools, interrupt education teaching for several weeks because of the deplorable conditions of the classrooms.
Gifted and talented instructors, they teach gifted and talented students. And so they look like they are heroes. But you need to get these instructors that are the most talented to teach the most challenged. The gifted and talented student gonna make it anyway. So you need money to do these things. You need money to draw people into the urban environment. Because you are in an urban environment, you need to understand you're competing with the big cities and you want to recruit. You do not want your student that graduated down the street, but they are leaving the area for more money. So it does play a major role. The other major role it plays is the equipment and technology that it can provide to students. Money must be provided to create smart classroom, academic environment of caring, counseling, just support, all of those things, teacher prep, student prep, test prep, just a host of things. You need to look at the student holistically, and funding must be provided there. So it may not be, in my mind, it may not be funding, but it may be a priority of how you allocating the funds that you receive. What's the priority here?
It's just a matter of, I would say in some instances, the expectation, the priorities of the community. So I'd say, how does society prioritize? How does the high school prioritize? How does the family prioritize? And so you take any subject area and you take any urban school district, and if that urban school district or urban institution or society prioritize coding, if we prioritize calculus 1, I mean, if we prioritize physics, if we prioritize African literature, I mean, whatever we prioritize, and we say these are the priorities of our community, these are the priorities of our society, our students, our children will rise to that. They don't know any different. They don't know at 4 and 5, and when they're starting to say, I mean, you ask them, everybody wants to be a fireman. I mean, but sometime at some point, the goals start to change. I'd like to be a professional athlete. I'd like to be a rapper. I'd like to be, in entertainment. I mean, so those goals start to change. I mean, that happens as a result of adults' priorities. We don't know anything about the student's grit. We don't know anything about the student's tenacity, verve, resilience. We don't know anything about that kid more than that singular test score, and then we can make some inference about the student's family income. But when you go back 2 generations, or even my parents, who all attended those one room schools, they had one teacher that taught everyone at the church during the week with one potbelly stove in the middle, and those persons went on to become everything because of the expectation. Grandmama and them, Papa and them never learned to read, never got past 3rd grade. but they determined education is important. And so the civil rights generation went to school, fought, marched, and when they got out, they were able to walk into those opportunities because they were ready and they were prepared. I mean, talking about under-resourced, an under-resourced institution. I mean, those were some under-resourced institutions. But the priorities, the expectations of that grandfather who could not read, that though he could not read, he was going to work from sun up to can't see no more so that his child would have an opportunity to learn to read.
Political decisions have systemically undermined this premise regarding funding and resource allocation in urban settings. The underfunding of education at the local, state, and national levels ensure failing urban schools continue the vicious cycle of underperformance, thus fueling the myth of their ineffectiveness.
All right. Hope everyone is back. At this point, I want to turn it over to LaJuan. First, thank you for putting together this video, documentary, and I would like to turn it over to her. And also, thank you to the producer, Chico Haley. Please know we will be tapping your shoulder for some other projects going on later on. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to LaJuan, and she will kind of lead us on a discussion of what we saw and what we thought about her documentary. So, LaJuan, have at it.
Okay, hello everyone. What I wanted to do was kind of highlight how funding plays a pivotal role in the failure of our school system. If the funds are not available to have adequate programs, qualified teachers, we're setting them up to fail. So in speaking with the different people to show the connection, I hope that came through, that our local districts aren't funding what they could fund, but yet they're requiring the schools to be at A level or a level 5. So it's almost like an oxymoron. It doesn't go together. If we don't fund them properly, we can't expect a high result. What do you guys think about that?
LaJuan.
Yes, Jamie.
Well, you and I both know about the school systems here in Jackson, Madison County, but I want to ask this question. When I ran for a school board, one of the things that the school board was responsible for was that many people were asking about the funding of the schools here in Jackson. And many of the seasoned school board members were telling their constituents that it's not the school board that approves, that actually funds schools, it's actually the county commission. When the school board approves funding a certain school project or funding a certain school, is it not mandated by the county commission to go by what the board has voted for? I mean, isn't that state law that the county commission has to pay for those things that the school board has paid for? I mean, has voted for?
No, Jamie. The county commission actually is in charge of that local school funding piece. Mm-hmm. I think the school board, like if a school submits some kind of educational program they want to, spend money on for the school, I'm thinking that goes through just the superintendent office, and certain things have to be approved by certain people. But as far as the local funding, the tax revenue, that's done through the county commission.
And that's the reason I was asking that question, because, we had that big debate with Building Madison over there, and I think it's the University of Memphis. And I think the superintendent, our former superintendent as of last week, he had asked the city council to pay for it, and they said that it is the county commission that pays for it, and the county commission said it's not them to pay for it. So it became a huge issue to where I don't know where it's at right now.
Okay, if I may kind of step in on a second, I think one important thing we talk about, and one of the gentlemen in the video talked about capacity versus effort. And as you guys take a public school finance class, you'll cover fiscal capacity and fiscal effort. And what we see is not that the gap between capacity and effort equals a deficit. What effort is what you're willing to do, what you prioritize. Capacity speaks more towards your ability to reach that funding goal. So what we're seeing is, what are you willing to place priority on in a goal to school funding? So I would submit that oftentimes we spend a lot of effort in management and control. So we spend an inordinate amount of money on making sure that the surveillance system works, or making sure that the security system works. And that speaks to what we prioritize and we believe about the people walking in the door. But when we start thinking about equalization of funding, when we start thinking about how much money it takes to actually fund an adequate education for an individual, that funding model is a lot different than allotting a certain amount of money for security, allowing a certain amount of money for surveillance, allowing a certain amount of money for wands to wand people to walk in the door. That actual money, which is very expensive, could be utilized to decide to spend adequately on what it actually takes to fund a student who walks in our door. And if we did that model on equalization terms, which is a basic tenet of public school finance, we would actually be funding almost opposite of the way that we actually do. And that's a huge thing to consider, because of how vital that is where we place our money is really on what we prioritize about the people we serve. So I think that has to take lead on how we look at the school funding model. So I think you're right on point with what you're saying. And I just caught that, and I had to think about that twice when I heard the gentleman speak about the whole capacity versus effort, because I think it's deeper than he could have expounded on in that few minutes.
I just wanted to comment, the two speakers, and I'm horrible with names, I don't remember their names, but I thought that having the two views, I think one was from the man that was from Lane, and then the white guy, I'm not sure, I think he was from Jackson Madison, explaining the domino effect of private schools and how that has impacted funding. Seems really, really relevant right now with the state push for vouchers. And I've noticed a lot on Facebook and social media, just everyday regular people asking, well, why does this funding matter to public schools? And, how do you think this is going to impact them in the long run? So I just thought that seemed really timely and relevant. I mean, it's always relevant, obviously, but people are really concerned about funding right now. And overall, Lawan, I thought it was a really good documentary. It was very good. I think you could show this in, it was so professional. I think it could be shown in a multitude of places.
Thank you, Ms. Jean. I just want to elaborate a little bit on what Jean said. It reminds me of what Mr. McGee said about desegregation and how it left the communities without those leaders, without those teachers, without those principals. Businesses closed. It changed the whole landscape of the community. And I can see the school choice having a similar impact. What do you guys think?
I actually talked to a guy that I actually grew up with, but he's a professor at UConn, Professor Preston Green. And he studies both law and education. And what he's indicated to me is that if the school choice movement plays out the way it will, this could be actually more detrimental to education for minority students than Plessy versus Ferguson. And I want you to think back. We're talking about going back past 1896. And the level of the way funding is and the inequities of funding that school choice brings us. It's a pretty Trojan horse. But once that Trojan horse is unleashed, I think the devastation that it will have is just so monumental that we may never recover. So if at all, and I've just been at a conference where we talked about school choice, and I know the state of Tennessee is guns blazing on this whole school choice thing. And I think something just came out of the news the other day about it. But when this is said and done, mark my words, you will see something worse than what Plessy versus Ferguson did to schools.
Dr. Robinson, can I elaborate a little bit?
Sure. Now, go ahead.
Well, I'm trying to figure out, the school choice because, as a conservative, I can see the point in that. But my question is, at what point do we say enough is enough? Apparently, in my views, I believe the public education system is not receiving the competition it needs to advance itself. And so therefore, it is what I believe is just settling. And so what they're doing is they're using these funds to actually not pay for the right things. And the school choice program that is initiated, you did say was going to be worse than Plessy versus Ferguson, but aren't we there now, Doctor? Aren't we there? Aren't we seeing that right now with white flight, with middle class flight? Aren't we seeing that right now as we speak?
Okay, so let's address the first, or let's work backwards to go forward. The first thing we look at is white flight. We have to really ask ourselves, why does white flight really matter? And if we make white flight the barometer by which we judge our importance towards progress towards education, what we just did by default is say our closeness to whites is our closeness to good. I'm not of the mindset that being the virtue or the gift of sitting next to a white person makes me better. My life has not explained that. I have too many examples of people who have gone to HBCUs and have excelled on the global scale to say that the mere sitting next to a person who is white makes me better. Now let's take that argument to school choice. What we're talking about, and I believe they talked somewhere along $7,200 or something to that effect, to offer to people to elect to go to a school of choice. Now we notice that school choice works one way. It is Black students going to a white environment and not the reverse. But if it takes $7,200 to do that, we haven't factored in the incidental cost of being in that environment. We haven't even factored in the cost of what happens to small groups of Black and brown kids who get sent to white schools under the idea that we're integrating the white classroom. We can integrate the white schools all day long. We rarely ever integrate the white classroom. I can almost guarantee you that if you go to a school now, and if you walk into the IB or AP classroom of a quote unquote integrated school, it looks vastly different than if you go into the standard level classroom across the hallway. So we've done a great job of integrating the white school. We've done a horrible job of integrating the white classroom. So even while we're there, we're not getting a fair shake. But what happens to the incidental cost? A field trip. Now, you decide to go on a field trip, but you know a field trip is not just that. I need to give money for lunch. I need to give money for wherever they go to eat. I need to give money for all the other incidental costs associated with a field trip. School voucher won't cover that. School vouchers will get you in the building, but it won't cover the social cost of actually being present in that environment. So automatically, we have students who are at a disadvantage, and it's an obvious disadvantage. And the sad part is, as parents, we bust our behinds to reach a certain level in life, to get our students, our children, whom we love, to go to a school that we think is going to give them a better launch in life than we had. And what we do not know is that every day in there is torture. Every day in there, they're running into teachers who don't believe they can succeed. And speaking to funding, we actually put them in an environment where the master scheduler is going to make sure that the least experienced, newest teacher is going to have 40 of them, whereas the more experienced, higher paid teacher is going to have a class of 8. Now, if you take the students and divide it by the salary of the teacher, you'll see a huge funding disparity. Because I've been in that class where I had taught an IB class, I had a class of 7. And if you take my salary and divide that by 7, and then go across the hall and take this brand new teacher, take their salary and divide it by 38, you'll see a huge difference in equity and funding for education. So I think in that sense, if we continue to voucher that way, and it only addresses a few who are quote unquote lucky enough to get that pass to go to the other side of town. Well, what happens to the ones who stay, who can't go, who can't take advantage of school choice? What happens to the schools, the communities, the alumni associations, everything of the students, the schools that are busted up right now? In Shelby County, we have schools that are only existing because of tradition, but there's nobody there to service. So Manassas High School probably has 300 students, but they're only there because of tradition, and it's so so undertreated that we're sitting there wondering why we still have this school existing. So I think that's the problem I have with that. And that's the reason why it could take us back past a place worse than school segregation, because there's no answer for that once we do.
I'd like to comment too, Jamie, or I'd like to respond. I do not believe that competition necessarily makes anything better. That is a capitalist view, and I do think that there's an appropriate place for competition, but it's a myth that all things that become competitive rise to the top. I truly, truly believe that our founding fathers knew what they were doing when they believed and said that we need free public education to have an electorate that's educated, and it's the foundation of democracy. I truly believe with all my heart that when public education goes, it is going to be one of the final crumbling blocks to our democracy. And I don't believe that we don't need competition to vote. So why do we need competition to be good at what we're doing in education? I think that that's a myth that capitalists who want to buy into and make a profit off of education are perpetuating.
Jamie,
I humbly agree with all of you all, but we have disagreements, but I do agree, and I thank you all for your statements. Thank you.
And Jamie, I'll put one more thing before I know Dr. Nelson wants to get in on this. What we've also seen in the charter movement and things like that, whenever we employ neoliberal aspects to education, we've seen it fall directly on its face. We cannot run schools like we run businesses because there's nobody to fire. I mean, if we think about in a business, when an employee doesn't do what they're supposed to do, there's a remedy for that. We fire them. We can't fire students. That creates a whole a plethora of problems when we start figuring out which students we can fire from education and just totally leave them to their own devices. And that's primarily the reason why we see those neoliberal markets fail. If you look at charter schools, the ones that succeed are the ones that don't offer lunch and don't offer transportation. That automatically segregates them because it leaves them to those who can fund their own lunch and provide their own transportation. We see those schools succeeding, but we see the ones who have to fund the two largest expenditures outside of salary, which is transportation and food service. We see them open on Friday but closed on Monday. So that's the reason why we can't use neoliberal principles to run schools. Dr. Nelson, I know you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I just want to clarify that if we're talking school choice, we should note two things. Charter schools are by far the most segregated set of schools in the country, followed by private schools, funny enough. Private religious schools are second most, in particular, private Catholic schools are second most segregated. And when we talk about sending students out with vouchers, we're not talking about sending them with vouchers that would afford a St. George's in Memphis education. We're talking about giving them $3,000 or $4,000, which is not going to get them into the private school that you're thinking about. It's going to get them into the private school where someone is literally sitting them in front of a DVD and letting the DVD teach them. As you talk about Dr. Green, Dr. Robinson, one of the things he talks about a lot is this idea of not having the civil rights protected of students of color in charter schools. So even as we talk about the idea that charter schools may be this panacea, I think we should be careful, because one of the things that Dr. Preston Green will warn us about is that many of the rights that we have, the civil rights that we have, that we know we've come to love, were earned in traditional public schools. And there is still some question about whether or not charter schools are state actors, whether or not your civil rights are protected in a charter school, or student civil rights are protected in charter schools. We almost know for a fact that teacher civil rights are not at this point. So I get that you say that we need some competition. I think I side with Jean in saying that I don't necessarily think competition in and of itself would resolve everything. But I also think that just pitching straight to school choice might be problematic. I think one of the things that Lawan's video points out is that we have some system level failures in school funding that make our schools appear like they're failing. But as the lady said in the documentary, I forget her name, I apologize, our urban public schools are creating miracles every day. They are using whatever funding sources they can to get what results we are getting. So I think before we start thinking about like, oh, we're at the Plessy point because schools aren't trying or students aren't trying, we need to start thinking about what at the systems level we have not tried.
All of this makes me want to call the state after we hang up, or after we get off of this. I'm calling to put my 2 cents in on their voicemails.
Dr. Nelson, I was thinking when you said that about the Plessy piece. Plessy versus Ferguson. And that we are not quite there yet because of the great things going on. But what measurement are we using to say we're successful or not? We're using a measurement that they've created. So how valid is that in itself, as far as state test accountability and the tests themselves?
Oh, I'm not talking about test scores, because even if we were talking about test scores, we wouldn't have anything to compare them to if we went back to the time pre-Plessy. But what I will say is that when I hear people say we're at Plessy already, that's a damning statement, right? About a lot of things that are both about the experience that students are having. Do I think that we could possibly end up at Plessy? Yes, I think so. But I do not think that we're at the point of forced segregation, and more than forced segregation, forced lack of resources to a point where we're actually letting students go to school with the idea that none of them will make it. Because still to this day, and this is actually part of the problem, right? That we'll have 1 or 2 students come out of most schools in a given year that are competitive anywhere. That is still a thing. And pre-Plessy, I don't think that was like, I think you had competitive students, but I don't think they had the social capital to move up into society, partially because that's just not how society was arranged during that time. I do not think as a whole we are there at that point yet. I think we could get there. I think to say that we're already at +8 skips a lot of steps, and would be if we were there, I think it would mandate that we had a much stronger response. Not to say that your video wasn't exciting, but certainly we wouldn't need that video plus some more.
I would also step further to say this. If we look at our statistics, if we look at our numbers, this quote unquote gap between black and white is never been statistically significant. It's never been that whites are just knocking it out of the park. If anything, this gap that we speak of is more of an indictment on white students in white communities than it is on black students in black communities, because a white student is more than likely to have a white teacher who is more invested in the community. And even with that, they are not knocking it out of the park at all. Whereas that black student, whom we assume or equate low socioeconomic status, is more than likely to have a white teacher of lesser qualifications, and still the gap is only 10 to 12%. So even in that, if we were to level the playing field authentically, if you read Savage Inequalities by Jonathan Kozol, if we were to level the playing field, you would see what you see in HBCUs. You would see where the #1 producer of doctors, the #1 producer of engineers, the #1 producer of lawyers, the #1 producer of all of these high professions, and if you want to harken back to civil rights, everyone of significance in the civil rights movement had the HBCU experience. You would see that if we leveled the playing field. And we're doing that on shoestring budgets. So you can't equate the amount of black brilliance that's coming out of meager circumstances that are systemically underfunded and undertreated. If we were to level that playing field, it would prove white supremacy to be all wrong, beyond a shadow of a doubt. So even if you look at those numbers, and I encourage you, look at the data, but not just look at the data on the condition of education report, but read the subcontext under it. They'll tell you that it's not statistically significant. What you see of this white-black achievement gap is probably more chance than reality. So it's something to take into consideration. What equal funding would actually say towards the master narrative about schools and about society.
Dr. Robinson, one more question. What is, I just threw this idea up here. What if a group or African-American community, say Lane College, decides that they want to create a charter school, or they want to create a high school that is a charter school, and they want to use voucher systems to help African-Americans that are in their community? What is wrong with that right there, Doctor?
Well, I mean, we've seen HBCUs do this all the time. If you look at Morehouse College, Spelman College, and Clark Atlanta University, you will see there was an overwhelming impact of the relationship of Mays High School in Atlanta, of Tri-Cities High School in Atlanta, of Douglas High School in Atlanta. You see those relationships there. And those are relationships that I know of personally, because it seemed at one point that Mays High School was a feeder school to HBCUs. And I'm quite sure if you look at most HBCUs, there are some local high schools in which they have partnered with, taken under their wings, and those schools become feeders to that particular college. The thing I have a problem with, and I think it was evidenced in LaJuan's documentary, was if you look at the funding level, I thought I saw something to a point of $8,200 per student, but the present voucher level is $7,200. So it's a full $1,000 less than what's already allotted for the student to stay exactly where they are. So what is the incentive to take less money to go to a school where you're going to be put in one area have a higher probability of being labeled as special education, and then have all the other negative connotations that come with being in that environment. We did not like having federal troops to bust us in the 50s. We did not like having milkshakes poured over our heads in the 60s. We did not like having our section or wing of the school where they put us at called the dungeon in the 70s. We did not like those who are treating us, as I remember in my high school, they called us Keishas and Tyrones in the 80s. We did not like all of those other negative connotations, but we're going to accept less money per funding to actually do that. If you think about it, it works for the state because they get to save money. Rather than paying $8,200 per pupil, they're paying $7,200 for people to then bust themselves an hour and a half over to a school that's supposedly their oasis. But we don't really take into account what happens once that student goes into that school. And that's problematic.
I would add to that, Jamie. I think even your discussion, when you say what's wrong with, I think you said Lane College, opening up a school to help its community, I think one, you start with the very deficit base of like there's some savior that has to happen. But I think even more than that, the one thing I never heard in your discussion was that the community wanted this. So it once again goes to the only way we can reform anything in terms of education for Black and Brown communities would be if someone did it without their permission, without their input. I don't think anything's wrong with charter schools. I think there is something wrong with doing education reform to a group of people. Now, that steps a little bit away from the funding issue, which I think Dr. Robinson is correct about. And if I recall, with the new education savings account bill that is trying to be pushed through by the governor, we're not even going to be getting the $7,200. Like, that's going to be almost cut in half. So I think we have to start thinking about what does it mean, and where do you get that money from, because things still cost. But at the core, I think beyond the money is that I think your solution or your question assumes that education reform has to happen to people, not with them, not alongside them.
I'll have to get back on you now on that, Doctor.
Wait, which one of us are you getting back with?
Both of you. Very good points. I mean, it's very good points. I just want the best, education for my children. And I think that many parents probably share the same thing, that they don't want to send their children to a school that, quote, isn't working. And if we offer them other alternatives, then we can actually see the schools improve if we offer other alternatives. That's just always been my belief. But now I'm seeing your points now, and it's making good sense.
Well, Jamie,
I would dare say that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, Jamie, I think last semester you were assigned one of my readings, Still Serving Two Masters. And it talked about the racialized roots of school choice. I think you should revisit that paper. Or maybe I didn't assign it, and if I haven't assigned it, I will. I did assign it.
First one I read, yes, sir.
Okay.
I just want to say, why do we have to have other alternatives, Jamie? Which you and I can always talk about that later. I've got family coming in, but why do we have to have other alternatives? Because I think public education is only as good as the public who supports it, the public who is involved in it.
Amen.
So why is it that we have to go outside of it? If they want to fix
public
it, then they need to
education
be involved.
I see public education similar to that of a car dealership. If I'm going to look for the best car out there, I go to the car dealership, and it's the car dealership's responsibility to provide me the best car that's out there. If I want a Mustang, they're going to bring me the best Mustang that's there in the car dealership. If they don't have the best Mustang, then I can just go to the next car dealership and find my choice and my decision of what I want to be a Mustang. Same way it should be with the school systems. If I have a child that I want the best of education, that school system must be able to provide me with the best education or the best quality education for my child if they're going to get my money. It's the same way with what I believe, in the car dealership. I believe that education should be treated like that. That's my philosophy.
to stay with your car analogy, I would challenge that instead of buying the car, we're building the car. I'd say the car is only as good as the people inside who are building it.
Well, I don't have time to build a car.
I would actually argue,
That's what we do
Jamie,
with
however,
education. Though. We're builders.
That's an ugly analogy because in car dealerships, you always lose. The buyer always loses in a car dealership. I mean, you just have to govern how much you want to lose. But I don't know if a person who's actually bought a car, they actually won. Like, even if you get zero finance, you still took a loss. The second you drive off the lot with this car, and with a used car, you're asking me to buy something that someone threw away. You know, so the car analogy, you may not want to really ride with that one as a total. But I'm also encouraged, because the beautiful thing about what we do and what you are now being empowered to do is you don't need us to encourage you to study the topics more. You know how to gather research. You know how to find what you need to find. We can put assignments together for you, but Jamie, you know how to find out more about school choice. You know exactly where to go and what to read. So never let us slow you up. You know how to get this information. But it also something for me to think about in a Education for School Change course. See you this summer.
I was gonna say, as you say that, I think this is an appropriate time to put in a shameless plug for those of you who are listening from afar. Those who are interested in our program or engaging in similar topics, please reach out to Dr. Robinson or myself, or I think you all know Ms. Grace Sylvester, so please reach out to one of us if you're interested in the program. We're doing innovative things like this all the time now, so we look forward to hearing from you.
And before we wrap up, I would like to thank all of you for attending this. This is very powerful. This is actually better than I envisioned. LaJuan, thank you for a great video and incredible production. And these things don't happen all the time in doctoral programs, and I do want you to kind of cherish the moment. But it's also endemic of what you can do. Once you have encouragement and exposure to the information, that all of you can do something like this and actually gather a group of like-minded individuals to engage in this kind of discussion. So with that, LaJuan, I'll let you kind of take us home and we'll close out for the night.
I just want to thank everybody for logging in, watching it. I am thankful for the discourse we just had. And like I said, I'll see you guys, Tuesday?
Yes.
Robinson and fellow cohort members and everybody else, family and friends, thank you so much for logging in.
And thank you for coming on a Friday. I know there's many things you can and are about to do, but the sacrifice of time on Friday to come in and be part of this discussion is incredible. So,
I mean, you could be meditating and fasting right now because of Good Friday.
Yes. So, appreciate you all, and we'll see you. Once again, you have our information, or you can get in contact with us. But I appreciate you all for being part of this. And with that said, I will close out. Thank you, LaJuan. Thank you, everyone else.
Good job, LaJuan. Congratulations.
Thank you, everybody. Good job.